Well, hello again, Ricecast family. We're back with another episode of the Ricecast. I am sitting across the table from the doctor, the pastor, Willie Rice. Pastor Willie, how are you?
Doing great. Good to be back here, and good to be back with everybody today.
We are getting through March in 2021, the year of our Lord. I'm not exactly sure. Why do we say, they're all the year of our Lord?
Well, that's the phrase. AD is a Latin phrase for in the year of our Lord. So
there we go.
There you go.
Look at this is one of those podcasts you're learning right off the bat. That's why we say the year of our Lord, 2021. Pastor, first question's got to be: is your bracket busted?
Oh yes, I actually didn't fill one out. I usually do, but my family has one. But by the time they informed me that it was happening, a competition, then I think it was too late. I think it was Friday, and I just wasn't paying attention. But had I been filling it out, I would not have picked Oral Roberts to defeat Ohio State and Florida. And here's what's funny about that. Some of you know Jeremy, Dr. Westbrook, is a big Ohio State fan. He came here from Ohio, and he fell in love with the Buckeyes. And, everybody has their downfall. So we were all razzing him a little bit because ORU. Yeah. And by the way, John Antonucci, who's on our staff, is an Oral Roberts graduate.
That's right.
So he was kind of razzing who's now his boss, Jeremy. Yeah. And I was kind of like, Jeremy said something about he was sick. He didn't know if he'd come in the office. And I said, well, Oral Roberts can heal you, that kind of thing. We were having fun with it. Right. But I was quite confident.
Oh, yeah.
The Florida, you have a Cinderella gets away with one. I thought, well, Florida will take care of business.
Surely. Right.
My team. And then Oral Roberts beat us. So Antonucci comes into the office sporting all of his Oral Roberts gear, hats, shirts. And he's no longer with us now, and that's not true. But no, he should be rightly proud. Congrats to the Oral Roberts University and their most famous alumnus, I guess, John Antonucci.
Yeah, it's impressive for a dental school to make it this far. I don't think anybody thought a school full of dental hygienists would make it this far, but good on them. I mean, good on them. I do think it's worth mentioning. I didn't hear anyone else talk about it. This is the kind of content you're only going to get here on the Ricecast. A lot of Christian colleges made the tournament.
Yeah, Abilene Christian was in. I think they're out now, though. But
Liberty.
Yes.
Did Oral Roberts. Liberty got in.
Oh, I didn't know that. They didn't stay long. I don't
know. No, out in the first round.
Okay.
But there's a couple now through the Sweet 16. Just a good representation out there from the Christian colleges.
Basketball is a sport that a small school can do well because if you have a couple guys, you can do well, and like football, you have to have a lot of great athletes.
Yeah,
and,
right.
So it's much harder for a small school to compete. But in basketball, you get to write 4 or 5 guys, boom.
Oh, or even I think Steph Curry showed up at Davidson, and all of a sudden they were...
then you have some good guys around a great guy, and the next thing you know, you're playing. So it's always fun to watch March Madness. I'm sure glad we have it this year, but I am still smarting from the Oral Roberts
Roberts upset.
I'm very, very still hurting from that one.
I think a lot of people, it's been funny this time of year, I think we're all tiptoeing a little bit because of last year.
Yeah.
We're not ready to really be into March and April yet. Yeah. I saw a great post on Instagram or something that was about a parent talking about spring break, and they said, I'm really nervous because last time I took my kid home for spring break, the school didn't take him back.
I saw that. And great.
So I think that's been the feeling of all of us. It's okay, March Madness can go on. Yeah. It's not as many brackets maybe that got filled out, at least in my neck of the woods. Because everyone I think is a little bit like, let's just make sure the tournament goes off okay.
Right.
But speaking of that, we are just, as we record this podcast, we are less than 2 weeks away from Easter.
Well, it's going to be such a big one this year because we missed it last year. We didn't miss Easter. I understand. We had, but we weren't able to gather and worship. Right. And that's what we do as followers of Christ. We gather and worship. And we weren't able to do it last year. Probably the only time in my life ever. And I hope it's the only time ever.
Yeah.
And so this one means more, And at Calvary, we also missed gathering on Christmas Eve. Many churches did, but we had some issues then. And so for us, this is special, and you're seeing people come back every week. Every week I'm meeting people back for the first time, and we've created some avenues on Easter with multiple services, even for the most cautious among us, to come back and be with us on Easter.
Yeah, it's going to be a very, very special weekend. I mean, it's really a great week of things. So this coming Sunday is Palm Sunday. We'll be continuing on in our sermon series there. We got some information about some things you can do for an Easter egg hunt in your community. You're going to want to see some of that. Then we have Good Friday. We're going to have Bible studies, like devotionals coming out through the app all that week. So that Holy Week will be a very, very special week that you want to be plugged in for. But you can get all the information on service times, where they are. We've talked a lot about the strict protocol service available at Clearwater and Eastlake, where masks will be required the whole time if you feel like you're in a vulnerable place and you've been hesitant to come back. That's going to be a space that will be very safe.
Yeah, that's our 8 o'clock service. Mm-hmm. That's the only one that's strict protocol. Right. So for the folks that don't want to wear a mask all the time, you're fine. We'll do normal protocol, which is we encourage people in the common areas right now. And again, that may change. Those protocols may change in the weeks to come.
Yeah.
But for Easter, right now, we kind of encourage people to we don't try to enforce it harshly, but we encourage you in the common areas to wear a mask when you get to your seat. That's just whatever you are more comfortable with.
Right.
Much like going to a restaurant.
Right.
But the strict protocol service, we wanted to create a space for those people who just have not been back, are more cautious for good reason. And we are going to require masks at the 8 o'clock service at Clearwater and at Eastlake. There's an 8 o'clock Sunday morning service, and we're doing strict protocol just to create that space for those who are, for good reason, the most cautious about coming back out. And many of them have not even been back to church.
Yeah.
So we wanted to say, hey, this is a safe space. We're going to the nth degree that we can to keep all distancing. Yeah. Everyone's in a mask, except the guys on the platform speaking or singing.
Right.
But everyone else is in a mask. And we feel like if you haven't been back at church in a year because you're concerned, this would be a great opportunity, either at our Eastlake or Clearwater campus for the strict protocol service.
Yeah. Yeah, it's going to be, that's again, 8 o'clock, Clearwater and Eastlake. And there's just a lot of services. You know, we really leaned into wanting this to be a safe experience for everybody. We did miss it last year. We weren't able to gather on Christmas Eve either. So it's Saturday night. There's a service here at Clearwater, 8 o'clock, strict protocol, Clearwater and Eastlake. And then at Seminole on Easter Sunday, it's 9 and 11. And at Clearwater and Eastlake, it's 9:30 and 11. And then 9:30 and 11 will be streamed online. But again, you don't have to remember all of that. That's the good news. You didn't have to write all that down, reverse and go in slow motion. No, it's all on calvary.us/Easter, or if you just go to calvary.us,
Perfect.
All the Easter information that you could need are there. Because we got childcare too.
Yep.
If you've not been to a live service, we have childcare available.
And Good Friday service also.
Good Friday.
On Friday at noon, just one service at our Clearwater campus. So if you're able to come, some people can't, during the week like that. But we did this once before, and we had great attendance. So if you can come Friday at noon on Good Friday, we will have a communion service and just a really meaningful time of remembrance of our Lord's death.
Yeah. And for those that maybe you're at work or you're not able to be here, that will also be streamed online on YouTube, Facebook, and calvary.us/watch. I think the students in our area are all off that day this year, which is kind of interesting. Yep. Maybe with some more families in here, but that's coming up. We're all very excited about it. It's going to be very fun as we move into April. Feels like 2021 is going by fast to me. I don't know if you have that feeling. Feels like to be looking ahead already almost April.
Here we are, almost April, and, of course, I'm getting at the age where they all seem to be going faster and faster, but it's been a great spring. It's been exciting to see many people coming back. Still not, 100% or anywhere close to it, really, but well over 50% now, and I think you're seeing that momentum, and we're excited about some things that we'll be able to announce in the next couple of weeks that will even I think create more momentum as we go into the summer, and so again, Easter just a great time of year for us.
It's going to be good. It's going to be good. Hope to see you there or joining us online if you are still staying at home. But we wanted to talk today about some things that have been going on recently after. How do you broach into this? There's two tragic shootings recently. I don't think that's probably the most blatant way to say it. There's two tragic shootings. There's one in Colorado recently, and then there was one in Atlanta, which is fairly close to us here in the South. And the one in Colorado, it's obviously very tragic. I mean, I think you just have to start there. It's just something, to me, it was a little bit of like, oh yeah, for a while it seemed like these were happening a lot. Then obviously with the pandemic and everything, very tragic. And our hearts and prayers are certainly with the victims and all the families affected by it. But the Colorado one, it seems like there's still some information to come out. I think you've said before, I love to reiterate, I think it's a great thing that, you don't just want to dive into topics like this with a hot take or anything that you don't have all the information.
Yeah, a lot of people have done that, and they did that certainly last week with the Georgia shooting. It was like, as soon as a little bit of information leaks out, what happens is people want bias confirmation. They want evidence that confirms their bias. Mm-hmm. So if they have a bias against whatever, and we certainly saw this in the Georgia case, as I'm sure we're going to get into, they immediately jumped in as if, see? And then, of course, what wasn't funny, again, it's just a terrible tragedy. But I think ironic, perhaps is the better word, is some of the biases then, as more information came out, were changed. Maybe the bias wasn't changed, but they weren't confirmed as they thought they would be confirmed.
Right.
And again, we're particularly talking about the Georgia case because we're still learning about the Colorado case. As we sit here, I don't know yet a great deal about this man. We know he has of Syrian origin and so forth, but we don't know anything about his motives in regards to that. I'm sure there are people with bias thinking, well, he's a Muslim extremist or he's a Muslim terrorist.
Right.
We don't know that.
Right.
Now, maybe we learn that, by the time people listen to this, it may be known. But we don't know that. But if we have a bias toward that, and you can understand why some people have a bias toward that, given the news of the last 20 years, and that people immediately go there. But the reality is that may not be the case at all. You may find out something else that triggered this man. And in some cases, we never know what triggers a person to do these horrible things. And they're just horrible. There's just no way, no one would desire, I hope, to in any way minimize the terrible tragedy of taking another person's life.
Right.
But you're right. People jump in and they have bias confirmation disorder. They jump in, grabbing any shred of evidence, and then they write these long articles. Social media is terrible about this because I think the sooner you can comment on something, the more intelligent people think you are because you're on the front edge of a cutting edge situation. And then the reality is you don't know what you're talking about.
Right.
So we don't want to be guilty of that either. But there are some things that have come out about the one in Georgia that have created some national conversations, and I think it's worth having a conversation about.
And I only started in the place I started because the what happened in Colorado was equally as tragic. We're going to spend the time talking about Georgia because we just don't know. We don't know as much about that one. And like you said, I think that's an important message to our listeners of to be really careful. Don't go, oh, there was a mass shooting and the guy's Syrian. I know the story. Like you don't know the story.
Yeah, right.
Like those are just two very base levels of information that you have. Wait till you kind of have the whole story. And like you said, maybe we could talk about it when we know more. In Atlanta, we do know more. We know that it was a young man that shot some victims at a massage parlor. One of the things that came out early is that the people that were the victims were Asian Americans that were victimized by the shooting, which were terrible. Again, we can't mourn with the families enough. Can't overstate that. But some of the other details that came out, he went to a Baptist church. He's a Christian kid, and he came out and said that it had something to do with eliminating temptation for him. So, like you said, these are the conversations we want to engage with. I think the first one that needs to be said is that a lot of information that did come out of this is that in the pandemic era, there has been a rising level of national animosity towards Asian Americans, some just negative things that have been said. And I think it's important to say in conversations like we've had this last year that we've got to be there for our neighbors, for the people in our community, and not stand by while they're unfairly targeted or harassed, or there's a Stop Asian Hate movement, and I think our church would certainly say, of course we
won't stop hate for anybody,
right?
And it's one of those things where I think I'm sure there have been some examples of that. It's not something I've followed closely, but it's not something that's unique even to our culture or unique to our time. There have, ethnic tribal rivalries are something that have marked human history from the beginning of time, and it is not unique to Western culture. It's not unique to Western civilization, but there are. And we've talked about this. There are racial biases that people have. I think the idea of, since COVID came out of China, or it appears to have, sometimes there's an anti-Asian bias that gets flared up.
Yep. And
people lump all Asians together, even though, it's very different if you're in China, from Korea, from Japan. And certainly we would decry any kind of racial bias or hatred toward people on the basis of race. We think that is absolutely incompatible with the teachings of Jesus. It's not even logical, and it is certainly incompatible with the teachings of Jesus. What's interesting about that is that was the immediate, reaction was, this is violence against Asians.
Right.
And so you had some people. There's a narrative that comes kind of out of the left wing, critical race theorist kind of school that is very much wanting to make white supremacy. You hear that talked about. I didn't hear the term white supremacy all that much until the last few years, but now that's being talked about as if that's the great toxicity of all toxicities. And so immediately when this happened, you had people decrying white supremacy. Well, the next day you find out, when you actually listen to the man, there didn't seem to be any racial animosity, at least in his statement. Now, again, you're listening to the statement of somebody who's a murderer.
Right.
So take that with a grain of salt. I would. If a guy just shot 10 people and he wants to tell me what he's thinking, I'm going to take that with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
Because whatever he's thinking is demented. It is distorted and polluted.
Right.
But he did not say, I was targeting Asians. It makes the crime no less tragic. And certainly we want to take this opportunity and any opportunity to condemn hatred based on race.
Yeah.
It's, as I said, not logical, and it is certainly not biblical, and it is certainly not Christian. So, but I'm not certain that that's what was playing into this case.
Right. And there is some things that have come out that I do want to talk about, but just to reiterate just what you said, to me, you got to take the moment and say that if our
we don't want to miss
Asian
them.
brothers
Absolutely.
and sisters are saying this is something they're experiencing, we condemn it. We condemn it the same way we were having this conversation last year.
There are people, and there's so many angles here, because there are people here who they revolt against this idea because, again, they saw people, white supremacy is the problem. And then, of course, that didn't seem to be the motive. And so they want to go, see there's nothing to it. Well, listen, I reject both extremes.
Yeah, right.
I reject the extreme that wants to see racial animus behind every act and the great toxicity of all toxicity. It's one toxicity. It's one flawed way of thinking and a very devious one. But I don't think it's behind every act, and I don't think it explains every act. And I think if that's the prism through which you view all of society, that's going to be a very distorted prism. Yet at the same time, when somebody tells you how they're feeling or what they've experienced,
right.
What kind of person doesn't listen? What kind of person doesn't say, hey, I'm sorry you feel that way, or I'm sorry you've experienced that. And we join with you, we stand with you to say it is stupid and it is wrong and it is evil to target people, to judge people in a group, and to target people with any kind of malicious intent, hatred, whether it's speech or certainly violent action, because of their race.
Right.
That is just wrong for people who have a biblical worldview, and we absolutely don't want to miss any opportunity.
Right.
We're happy to condemn it. We're the ones, the true followers of Christ, we've had conversations about this where churches have fallen short in history. So I'm giving a shorthand here. But true followers of Christ were the ones who were condemning from the beginning racial hatred and racial tribalism. Go back and look at the movement of Jesus. We're the ones who believe Jesus takes all these people from different tribes and different races and different tongues and different nations, and builds a new humanity in Christ. That's at the core of our movement, and it has always been at the core of our movement. And when our movement, the Christian movement, didn't reflect that, it's because that movement had gotten corrupted by sinners.
Yeah, that's right.
But the Jesus movement has been clear from the beginning. All people are created in the image of God. All people matter to God. And God is trying to make a new church out of this diverse humanity of all kinds of people.
Right. And even a thread back as far as you can look, as we're talking about now, the temple and the temple's original design to have a place for men, for women, for Jewish people, for Gentiles. Yeah. This was supposed to be an inclusive thing. So again, just one thing I had mentioned to you before we started recording is I just don't want to repeat word for word a podcast we've already done.
Sure.
But you got to take the time to say, listen to your neighbors in your community, listen to your friends, your family, listen to these people when they're saying this. That was very well said the way you just said it. And yeah, of course, decry any sort of stereotyping, any sort of in that vein. But there was another bit to this. So like you said, the person that committed the crimes, the young man that committed the crimes, came out and said that his motive, which you alluded to just a minute ago, was to eliminate temptation. Was his? He was like this. He had said that, which again, I think it's important to say. This is a person not in a frame of mind that he just committed heinous crimes. But a lot of people have re-engaged a conversation about purity culture. Purity culture, something a lot of, if you grew up in the evangelical world in the probably like the late 90s, early 2000s, I would say is maybe like when it peaked. That there were shades of this, of like your temptation and what is causing temptation and things like that. So yeah, I do think that's a conversation worth having.
Well, it's very much so, and it was. I mean, it has reached the pages of the New York Times. It reached the pages of national news organizations across America. This young man grew up in a Southern Baptist church. I think his father at some point was even in the ministry, not at this church, but at some point. So, I mean, it wasn't a casual or passing relationship. We have people that sometimes come to church, they've been here, but they're not really in. He was in. He was a member of the church, and seems like a good church. I don't know much about it, but it was certainly an active Southern Baptist church, and I think on the Reform side. So, what happens again is this bias confirmation. What happened is in the secular world, people who have a very negative view of evangelicals in general, Baptist in particular, conservative Baptists in particular, jumped on this to say, see, look at that toxic culture. Look at what it produced. Look at this demented view of sexual temptation and human life and a valuing of women and yada, 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 yada. Much of which I think, again, is unfair. However, it does raise some interesting questions that when you have the moment to explore them, we should explore them.
Yeah.
But you would almost think from reading in New York Times, the Washington Post, et cetera, that, Baptists are cranking out mass murderers at an unprecedented rate, which is not true.
Right.
In fact, so far as I know, this is the first time I've ever heard of somebody involved in one of these mass shootings that has come out of a Baptist church and has been involved heavily in evangelical culture. There may have been others, but it doesn't fit the profile that I recall. But that did not stop people around the country from saying, hey, this is your fault. You are teaching some kind of toxic view, and this is what is produced. Well, I reject that outright. This is a person who is a murderer, and it's hard to get inside his brain and think about what would cause anyone to go out and do such a heinous act. The thing I think is worth exploring, though, is are there things in how we have approached, i.e. purity culture? Yeah. It's almost become a derisive term now because there was as the sexual revolution swept across our culture and swept even into our churches, there was a corresponding backlash of Christian leaders who then wanted to equip their people to live a life of sexual moral purity in the midst of such a sexually impure and immoral culture. So what you had in many youth groups and in many churches was this corresponding counterpunch, which they began to realize this is, affecting our kids. Pornography is now ubiquitous. The idea of sleeping out or having sex, we don't even have to use a euphemism, having sex outside of marriage is now almost universally accepted. And so there was this, how do we arm kids to think Christianly, morally in such an age? And all of what we did was probably not as wise as some of what we did. And so what now has created, and now you've had a backlash to that, of people looking at some of the things which were said by conservative churches, some of the emphases that were made by conservative churches, that now people are looking at going, I think maybe you were a little imbalanced in how you responded there. And I think some of that is fair. Some of that is fair. But I want to hasten to add, the answer to some excesses in the purity culture, we're putting it in quotes there, is not an impurity culture. Okay, the answer for us as followers of Christ is not to say, well, we don't want to live pure lives. The answer is not, well, let's just wallow in sexual immorality like the rest of our culture. Let's embrace a hookup culture. Let's embrace let's go to a massage parlor culture to do things other than get a massage. We're being very delicate there.
Yeah.
Are you proud of how we're being very delicate? To engage in sexual immorality. The answer is not, hey, let's just take down the walls and wallow in the sexual confusion of our age.
Right.
But I am happy to have a critique or a conversation about how do we wisely and biblically think through the issues of sexual temptation and living a life that aspires to purity when we are awash in sexual impurity. And I don't think we have always done it as well as we could.
Yeah, but important to trace back the origins. I'm glad you did that, because there's going to be people that maybe are new to their faith journey, and they weren't around in the late 90s, early 2000s, like I said, when I say this thing peaked, I mean it was a leading conversation topic. There were conferences built around this idea. And I also want to just reiterate something you said. I mean, I think we've taken this tone in this podcast before, but I think I encourage it as you approach situations and you think about people that are thinking differently or you have critiques of. I don't think it was born out of an malicious intent. There were a lot of teen pregnancies going on. I was in the youth group about this time, so I lived.
No, it's a reaction to the sexual revolution, which is a denial of the biblical sexual ethic. So when you get, when a tidal wave comes into your village, you look for a life raft.
Right.
And so we did lots of things like purity rings and a lot. And again, let's give everyone the benefit of that out here. Most people the benefit of that. They were trying to instill a biblical sexual ethic. Well, some things, now people, one of the best-selling books was Joshua Harris's book back in the day about I Kissed Dating Goodbye. Maybe it was the peak of that culture. Well, he has since repudiated the book, and I think he's even repudiated Christianity since then. I mean, I know he's left his marriage, and last I heard, he was now acknowledging he wasn't even a believer, and I will apologize if I'm wrong on that, but I think that's accurate. So, so there's now been this rejection of purity culture.
Right.
So I think that the good question maybe to explore is, okay, where have we made some errors?
Where did it miss? Right.
Where can we fine-tune our purity message in a way that doesn't create unhealthy responses to temptation, and particularly does not create unhealthy dynamics between how men view women. And again, I don't think you can take this man's thinking, that far, because his thinking led him to do a heinous and irresponsible act.
Right.
But you are looking for, are there seeds there that can, at times, not one person in 100,000 is going to do what this guy did. But are there things in this purity message that maybe were distorted? And if so, what are they, and how do we respond to them?
Right. And I think that's great. Everything you just, that was a great transition.
Okay.
Because, that is the question of, okay, so let's look back and let's have that healthy ability to say, well, where were we off? Because like you say, this is where people are responding and saying, well, this this young man was led to this
Yep.
conclusion.
Yep.
And I think a lot of it does stem from that. I remember, like I said, growing up in it, I do think, and maybe that's the better form is the question, that the onus or how much of this responsibility was given to women or to girls that grew up in the youth group to protect their male counterparts.
Yeah. And this didn't start with the evangelicals in the late 20th century. I mean, there's a reason why Muslims put women in burqas. There's a reason why hyper-fundamentalist groups, want women to wear skirts down to the ankle, and so on and so forth. We can all think of multiple examples of that. And I think, sometimes the evangelicals in the last part, we came out with our own Baptist burqa, really. And it was to, and I say that because I have talked with, I have listened to a number of women who have reacted to this, where they were, and several of them wrote about this last week, and I think these are legitimate conversations, where they were actually pulled aside by youth pastors, and it wasn't just a modesty conversation. Look, I think Christian women should aspire to a healthy biblical modesty. The Bible talks about that. By that we mean, don't sexualize your body. Don't sell your sexuality as a way of manipulating, calling undue attention to yourself, manipulating others. That is certainly not something I think that would be consistent with a pursuit of Christ-like holiness. But there's an imbalance to that, and that imbalance was to come to young girls and to women and say, it's your fault.
Right.
So that men who were typically in charge, struggling with sexual temptation, were blaming women.
Right.
I've actually heard stories of women who disfigured themselves because they were told they were a stumbling block to men. Wow. Or they've dressed in ways that seemed uncomfortable or extreme to them, not the ways they wanted to dress, because they were told they were stumbling block. There's still many, many people in what some would call evangelical movements, not the kinds I would tend to identify with, who will rail against women wearing certain things. And the gist of it all is, your job is to protect me from temptation. Well, I would, if I were speaking to a group of women, I would say godly women ought not to use their sexuality in a way that is ungodly. However, when I speak to a group of men, you don't get to blame women for your problems.
That's right.
Okay. You don't get to blame women for your lack of self-control.
Right.
There will always be women who are not as modest as others, particularly in this culture. You're not going to be able to destroy. Think about the demented thing this guy was thinking. He's going to take away temptation?
Right.
What? If he burned down every massage parlor in Georgia, it's like they don't have them in Tennessee. Yeah. It's the problem wasn't in the massage part. That may have been a problem, and I'm not going there because I don't know anything about what was going on in there or the people who were killed, and I don't want to dishonor them.
Right.
They did not deserve this.
Of course.
Many times when those places are places of sexual conduct, immoral conduct, there are women being trafficked many times. So let's set that aside. But the problem is not in there as much as it was in him. In him. Now, so how do we deal with temptation? It isn't going to be to say to our sisters, it's your fault that I have a struggle with this. We need to look within ourselves and say, okay, this is part of my fallen nature. Right. What must I do to help to battle this temptation? Because we are going to battle temptation.
Right.
So how do we battle temptation in a healthy way, in a biblical way, in a mature way, but not a way that creates this excessive self-loathing where I don't understand what's happening to me sexually and I don't accept who God has made me to be sexually. So there's this, I'll tell you this, 10 times more than somebody going, in fact, I think this may be the first story I've ever heard of somebody going out and doing mass murder to remove temptation. I have heard many stories of people taking their own life. And, and a lot of times you can't share what you know publicly, but I've heard multiple stories of somebody taking their own life. And honestly, part of it was a self-loathing because they could not control something and they hated themselves. Right. And the violence they end up doing is against themselves. That's also awful. We need to understand a healthy view of sexuality,
Yeah.
and one that does try to deal with temptation, because sexual immorality is real and it's destructive. But at the same time, we don't want to turn our battle for sexual purity into a loathing of ourselves or a manipulation of someone else.
Right.
And I think sometimes that's where we so exalted this purity value that when people fell short or when they did struggle, whether it was in their own private life or whether it was with another person, they then heaped so much guilt and shame upon themselves, as if, God doesn't love me anymore, or I'm not valuable to God anymore, that I think that is it just created a lot of things that were not healthy.
Yeah.
So, look, I get that it's a difficult thing, because dealing with sex is a difficult thing, isn't it?
Yeah,
Most people deal with sexual temptation in one form or another. Most people have sinned sexually in one form or another. I mean, if Jesus defines it as our own thought life, I mean, I don't know every other human being in the world, but most of the people I've talked to at some point in their life have struggled with some measure of sexual sin or sexual temptation.
Yeah.
So it's real. We want to follow Christ. We believe that as followers of Christ, we do want to live sexually pure lives, but we don't want our struggles against sin to become such a burden that we are buried with shame and self-reproach, and we cannot lean into the grace of God and find the help of God and help of our brothers and sisters, where we could get in a room and say, hey, I'm struggling here, or this is a temptation for me, or would you help me?
Yeah.
I know many guys who have said, hey, would you share a computer password with me so that, that's one way. It's not the only way, but it's one way. Just put up a guard, or, hey, would you, this is a battle which we're going to face. It's a battle which is going to continue, because we live in a culture that has fully embraced the sexual revolution, which basically says, whatever you want to do, you can do.
Yeah.
Well, that's not true either. That lie has destroyed millions of lives. So we don't want to embrace the lie. We want to embrace the truth.
Yeah.
But we need to understand we need grace, we need kindness, we need mercy. And so I've said a lot there.
Yeah.
I've said a lot there. But one of the things I really want to speak against, because I think I saw it and I never saw it, now I look back and I see it, was almost putting women in a place of where they are manipulated and controlled, i.e. the evangelical burqa. In order to supposedly protect a man's temptation. And then what happens also is, then when a man does sin sexually, who does he blame? Well, instead of taking the sin on himself, he tends to blame the woman. And again, there's so many layers to this. Even when you're in an abusive situation, the man blames the woman. She was too tempting. Well, you know what? That's just not going to fly. We need to first look at I think this starts with being honest and looking at our own sin and our own weakness and owning that, and not as men putting the blame upon women.
Yeah, it's exactly well said. I mean, it really it created this moment where I think one of the things you just mentioned that I maybe hadn't even seen it through this context before too, is you have these young women too. We're talking like teenagers usually when these conversations were most rampant, already dealing with what we know, so many body issues. Like we know our culture is just such a place that brings that, with the way women are represented in the media and all in advertising and all these different things. And then you added this other layer of body issues of you're sort of responsible for what's going on with the other guys in the youth group.
I've talked to them. You've had, and again, very often it was a male youth pastor or male pastor figure saying to a woman, your breasts are too large, your pants are too tight, your whatever is too whatever. And you're right. They don't understand what it is to be a 15-year-old girl.
Right.
And at the very least, modesty conversations should be women with women and men with men, and older spiritual women talking to younger women about appropriate ways.
Yeah.
Because again, the other side isn't the answer either.
Right.
To sexualize yourself and use that as a way of manipulating others. We're not advocating that.
Right.
But we are saying that there was a lot of things done in the name of purity that really sound a lot more like legalism.
Right.
And a lot more like judgmentalism and my sin is your fault ism.
Right.
And I really hear our sisters when they are speaking about that. And I still hear men sometimes talk about sexual morality and sexual purity in ways that make me cringe.
Yeah.
Because instead of accepting my sin, it's blaming.
Oh, yeah.
So let's just be as frank as we can be on this podcast. If you were out in public and saw a woman in a state of undress, let's just say, immodest, that still does not give you the right to treat her improperly,
100%.
To act inappropriately,
right.
Whether with violence or catcalls or anything else.
Right.
Okay, she may be an attractive woman, and she may be in a particular state of, whatever, undressed. Maybe we would go, I wouldn't want my daughter to be dressed that way or a wife to be dressed that way. Guess what? Turn and go the other way.
Right.
And let me tell you a story that maybe men will hear. And my friend J.D. Greer tells this story because he preaches to a lot of college students. And, they're like, well, we just can't control. We can't help.
Right.
And he goes, that's nonsense. Okay, and we all think at some point, well, I can't. And he said, that's not. He said, suppose you were with your girlfriend and you were home alone in her house alone. The lights are dim. You get the picture. Nobody's home. And you start, getting amorous on the couch. You're making out, and all of a sudden your brain just says, well, I can't control it. I'm, whatever the bases are, you're running the bases, and you know where it's going. And he said, and you think, well, I can't stop. He said, but suppose at that very moment, before you had gotten too far, you heard a car door slam in the driveway. And you realized her father had just come home, who, by the way, is home from a tour where he's serving as a Navy SEAL, and he's just been out, shooting firearms with his buddies. And so you hear the car door slam while Captain So-and-so is walking up the doorway. He said, what would you do? Yeah. And, of course, the answer is you'd get a control of yourself in a hurry. Yeah. It would be a matter of life and death, right? Lights would come on. Shirts would return to their appropriate place. Right. You get the point.
Yeah.
So he says, so you can control yourself.
Right.
If you're motivated properly,
right,
you do know where there are lines and where not to go. And so we don't want to put ourselves in tempting places, obviously. Right. That's one of the lines, we would all teach one another. But you cannot blame women and say, well, I couldn't help myself. That is something you hear men saying, and it's a really toxic idea. So to the degree that this moment gives us an opportunity to say, hey, that's a really toxic idea. And I get not 1 in 100,000 are going to go kill someone.
Right.
But it's still a toxic idea. And if this gives us a moment to say, that's not the way to handle sexual temptation. That's not the way to talk to our sisters in Christ.
Yeah.
And it's not their fault. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about what's our fault. Let's talk about how to live a holy life. And let's have better conversations than maybe we had in the past. Yeah,
and then that's all important to say. The other thing you brought up, I wanted to reiterate. You talked about the a coming out of the purity culture movement. The idea of purity did sort of start to get muddled. And again, when I talk about this, I'm talking from the student version of Anthony that lived through it in the youth group. The idea of purity did sort of start to get muddled as to once you break it, once you ruined it, it's over.
Right.
It's over. There's it at its most extreme became pretty incompatible with grace and real base.
It was almost like a search for the Holy Grail, and this is the greatest thing. And by the way, you talk about prosperity gospel. It bled into this because the idea was if you will do this, and you will wait until you're married to have sex, then everything will go well with you. Yeah. You will have a perfect marriage, and it will be the incredible. Well, anyone who's been married knows marriages take work, and I'm glad you made it to the marriage altar and have not engaged in sexual activity. I think that's the right thing. I think that's how we understand biblical morality. that we should aspire. The bottom line is what we're saying is that sexuality is meant to be in a relationship of fidelity, of responsibility, and love. Of love. And I know you get those things before you get to the marriage altar. Obviously, you can be faithful and loving, but the marriage altar, it represents that place where you make a commitment to be faithful. You make a commitment. And we believe, well, the Bible teaches that sexuality is made for that kind of relationship so that two people could be joined together as one flesh. And there's a spiritual component to it. So that aspiration is right. But if our desire for purity becomes hypocrisy, becomes legalism, becomes condemning of others, I'm better than you are because I did this and you didn't do this, then you've missed the boat. It's not about, hey, this helps me love Jesus. I'm trying to pursue his best for my life by his help, by his grace. It becomes, I'm better than you. I'm trying to earn God's favor. And that creates a dark side of real toxicity. And that is a lot of Christian teenagers have struggled with. So I disagree with the New York Times saying, oh, evangelicals don't know anything about sex and they're creating monsters. They hate us, and we know they hate us, and so that's not a surprise. But at the same time, we can look into what we were doing and ways we were doing it to say, how can we do it better? How can we aspire to what the Bible teaches us is holiness in a way that isn't legalistic, doesn't condemn others, isn't based on arrogance, I did this, and is infused with grace all the way through, understanding we are sinners who have been saved by grace, and we need God's help day by day to make it.
Right, and I think it's so good, so much good in there. I guess I just want to button that quick and say, because we touched on this, but just to make sure the message gets out there to, like you said, to the men. You're not allowed to blame anyone else for your position on this. To the women,
zero. You get zero blame. You don't get to play that card.
Right. To the women, you are not walking around solely responsible for the sexual morality of every man you're around. And I think that, to me, is one of the more not one of the more. They're all really bad outcomes that when this is done improperly. But for women to not know that they are an agent in this thing, that their relationship to God is their relationship to God, and they're not responsible for
it. Treats women as commodities for men, and that's what's wrong. We ought to be able to see our sisters as our sisters, and love them without sexualizing them, thinking of them as temptations or problems, or, hey, that's in you. You've got to get to a point where we love our sisters as sisters, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters, and we treat them with all respect and all purity and all deference, and we can interact with them in appropriate ways. There are inappropriate ways, obviously, we want to steer clear of, but there are appropriate ways, many appropriate ways, where we can have good relationships, healthy relationships with women as sisters in Christ. And when you simply see them as temptations, then there's something inside of you. And very often that's being fed by something else. And that is a unhealthy and ungodly way to look at our sisters. And again, all you have to do is look at Jesus to see it. He knew how to treat women, and he treated them with kindness, with grace, with respect, and saw them, as daughters of the King. And brought the message. Didn't mind having a conversation with a Samaritan woman who had quite a reputation. And again, there are moments, I get it, there's so much here. We can talk about guarding our hearts and avoiding inappropriate conversation. We should. But there are so many appropriate opportunities to respect one another, to have conversations, and we don't need to become, idiots. And acting in ways that diminish and demean the role and worth of women in our life in order to be sexually pure. The other women aren't the problem. Sin is the problem. You're the problem. Hey, Bubba, you're the problem. Okay, you're the problem. And let's start with that.
The other group that we kind of talked about that I think is important is this, just to speak out against and make sure the message is clear to anyone listening. The blew it mentality. I blew it sexually is so it's over. It's not. That's just not the message of Christ.
You're in a long line of people who have blown it sexual.
Right,
Okay,
right.
If we're going to have a meeting of hey, everyone who's sinned sexually, it's
Yeah.
going to be, we're going to need some extra chairs.
Yeah.
Okay, so and look at how Jesus responded to people who had fallen sexually.
Yeah.
The stories, the people he had problems with were the religious hypocrites.
Right.
But there were many people who had sexual issues in their life, and Jesus treated them with grace and kindness. Again, did not condone that. We need to understand sexual sin has a great harm.
Right.
But at the same time, if you've blown it, if you've sinned, it doesn't mean God is putting you on the shelf. It doesn't mean you can't have a great marriage. It doesn't mean that you are somehow soiled forever and you cannot be forgiven, you cannot be redeemed, you cannot have healthy relationships. I reject that also.
Yeah.
And I mean, again, my goodness, just look at the Gospels.
Yeah.
And by the way, one more thing. We can talk about this maybe on and on, but and my wife and other women have helped me with this. We, as men, we read the Gospel stories like the woman, the Good Samaritan. Let's take that one, for instance. She was married multiple times, right? Living with a man, not her husband.
The woman at the well.
The woman at the well.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah, I got my stories mixed.
Yeah, I got you.
She's the Samaritan woman,
Right,
but she's at the well. She was a good Samaritan, but a different kind of good Samaritan. Okay.
She was a good Samaritan.
And but the woman at the well, we immediately hear those stories of those women, and we think men sometimes. I know in my own life, when we think about these Bible stories, we didn't empathize with the women. We didn't think about, because we're not women.
Right.
But when you think about her story for a few minutes, and you begin to go, now we don't know the details of her story.
Right.
But I wonder what they were. What were they? Why had she been with so many different men? Do you think it was all her fault? Some of it may have been her fault. No doubt some of it was. Jesus told her, go and sin, no more. Well, that's another story, John 8.
Right.
But he led her out of her sin.
Yeah.
But my goodness, sometimes we look at that and we want to blame the woman. The woman, she's the sinner.
Right.
Well, you don't know what she had been through. You don't know if she had been in an
right.
abusive relationship. You don't know if a husband had left her high and dry. You don't know what had happened in her life. My guess is, yes, she had sinned. But my guess is, if I had $100 to bet on this one, is it wrong to bet on Bible stories? Maybe it is. If I had $100 to bet on this one, I would bet in her story she had been sinned against a bunch too.
Yes. Oh yeah.
I'd bet good money on that one. So and hopefully the Lord will forgive us for gambling on Bible stories. But don't you know that's the case?
Oh yeah.
Don't you know? So and yet how did Jesus treat her? With respect, with dignity, had a conversation with her. And then entrusted her with the gospel message to go into Samaria and share with the rest of the town who Jesus was. That's the Lord we serve. So if you've messed up, if you've blown it, first of all, you're in a long line, big crowd. Take a number, okay? Yes, you and a bunch of other people.
Yeah.
Do you think God didn't know that when He died for you? You don't think God knows that when He says, "I love you"? Of course God knows that. And guess what? He loves you.
Right.
And He's not done with you. You're not damaged goods. I mean, we're all damaged by sin. So yes, we're damaged goods, but we're not the kind of damaged goods that you put on a shelf and say, "I can't use you anymore." In fact, God loves to use broken things. That's where He gets the glory. So quit walking around with that shame and guilt. Take it to the cross. Confess your sin where you have sins to confess. And then realize God is a God of healing and restoration and redemption. That's the message of the gospel.
And you got to look at that woman at the well story even, and the way that Jesus dignifies a woman who is at the well at a certain time of day because of how she's treated by the other. So that dignity, the dignity, the respect, the love for people should be a mark of us, no matter what they're bringing.
He walked up and talked to her when no one else would.
Right. The other story you touched on, I do think you have to include in this conversation, is the woman who was caught in adultery and who was
the John 8 story.
What's spoken out against is religious hypocrisy.
Yeah.
So
I've preached that text several times here, and we did a message. People could maybe Google it or look it up on our stuff. But we titled it "What Would Jesus Do?"
Yeah.
And because to me that phrase is most typified in that story.
Yeah.
We know what Jesus would do with someone who is a sexual sinner.
Yeah.
All you got to do is read the story.
Right.
And the story was where the religious crowd tried to use that to shame her. It really wasn't about their motive there was not righteous living.
Right.
Okay, their motive was not
Right.
purity. Their motive was to trap someone so they could make themselves look important. And Jesus exposed, and part of their problem, of course, was they didn't deal with their sin. That's the whole story. Jesus right on the ground said, whoever's without sin. Well, what did he just do? He took the mirror and turned it on them.
Right.
And so their problem was they hadn't dealt with their own sin. They didn't see their own sin. They didn't see their own culpability. And so many people who are criticizing and condemning sexual sinners are those who have minimized the sin in their own life.
Right.
And the bad guys in that story were the guys who are the religious crowd with rocks in their hands. And we don't want to be that crowd.
Right.
I don't want to be that crowd.
Right. And I, as I know, we're a little bit longer on this one than we have been on some others, but I think this is so worth saying because we've touched on it a couple of times, and I think it's important to bring here. There are a litany of ways that we could look back on purity culture and say conversations that weren't handled right, things that should have been done differently. But you've touched on this a couple of times, and I just think it's worth noting. It's yet another example of, though, you cannot throw the baby out with the bathwater. There is a way, the things that have spun. So that purity culture movement is in response to a lot of the sexual revolution stuff that's going on. And now in 2021, we sit at a place where pornography is at an all-time high.
Yeah.
It's led the industries that feed pornography, the trafficking, all of these things are running wild. So it's not a conversation we can just say, well, we're not going to talk about it anymore then. We have to keep working at this.
The answer to the excesses and flaws of a purity culture is not an impurity culture.
Yeah, right.
It is a gospel purity culture, not a legalistic purity culture. So we need to lean back in and say, how do we have gospel understanding regarding the issue of purity? And as we know, gospel is about acknowledging our sin, but yet receiving his grace and knowing his grace is sufficient and knowing his love is demonstrated for us on the cross. It's the gospel.
Yeah.
We need gospel purity conversations, not Pharisaical, legalistic purity conversations.
Right. Yeah. So it's a conversation we have to keep having. We have to look back and see where we got it, where we were right, where we were wrong, and adjust and go forward, because it's not a conversation that we can stop having. I know
Correct.
everybody, parents out there that have
Every
kids,
parent is got to be thinking, how do I help my child, if they're going to be a follower of Jesus, think through sexual purity? What does it mean? What does it look like? How do I help them process it and understand it? Not so that they're fearful. I don't want them to be fearful. I don't want them to be ashamed.
Right.
I don't want them to be repressed. I want them to be strong and bold and courageous and loving, and yet desiring of a real loving relationship.
Right.
The problem with sexual impurity and the sexual revolution is not that it made too much of sex. The problem is it didn't make enough of it. So how do we create a vision of sexuality that is holy and loving? That is that's what draws us. Not the fear of failure, but the desire for this greater thing that God has made us for.
Right.
Because deep down, even the people that have wallowed in the impurity culture, you know what they want? They look at healthy, loving relationships and say, I wish I had that.
Yeah.
Right? Even the people in Hollywood, they're still getting married. It's like deep down they know what I really want is this healthy, loving relationship. That's what I really want. And so Jesus is the answer to that.
Yeah.
That's what God has made us for. And
Yeah.
that's the vision we want to create, not the legalistic, condemning, arrogant, rule-following culture. So there's a balance, and we're just going to have to keep working at it.
Yeah. Yeah. Important conversation though to keep having. And all the props I know go out to our I know our student ministries at all of our campuses take this conversation very seriously.
Yep.
Approach it very delicately. I can say, even just knowing the people that are in those positions, that conversation has changed even dramatically from when I was in youth group and the way they're having it, and in some ways learning, and in some ways addressing new issues that have come up. Because in my day we didn't have. Back in my day.
Back when you were.
Wow.
Yeah.
I just said back in my day.
which was a century ago, wasn't it? It was in the last century.
It wasn't that long ago.
You're old, man.
But we didn't have phones. There's so much we didn't have that now they're having to.
Listen, if you need one thing to do today when this is over, pray for your youth pastors.
Yeah.
Pray for our teachers and leaders at Calvary Christian High School.
Oh, yeah.
Pray for everybody that's laboring in student and child ministry, because they're dealing with challenges that were unheard of just, it seems like, last week.
Yeah.
I mean, just a few days ago. And we want to, and I can tell you, our team, we want to have these conversations. We want to have them well. Mm-hmm. We want them to be rooted in the gospel. And boy, it takes wisdom and strength, and we won't get it right all the time.
Yeah, that's
but
right.
we are aiming for a godliness and a holiness that's rooted in gospel values, and we'll keep working toward that.
Yes, we will. And we will be back again soon with another episode of the Ricecast. Thank you so much for listening, for following along, for all the shouts out when I see you in the church lobby and things. Everybody that says they're a listener, that's always so encouraging. Wherever you're listening, if you could leave a review or rate the podcast, that's always really helpful. Helps us get the word out about the podcast, and share it with your friends and family and all those nice things. That's all very encouraging and helpful. So thank you to those who do that. And we'll be back again with another episode here very soon.